Hey folks, Bruce McDonald, Talamanca Review. Just thought I'd pop on and do a podcast, but because I felt so inspired. So today I want to talk a little bit about the power of the Christ and what we should all be taking from the Christ, because he came with a few core messages, and I think everybody should be incorporating those messages into their lives. Now, the most important message of the Christ, in my estimation, for managing your own journey to self is the power of forgiveness. And nobody comes even close to the Christ in terms of articulating the absolute power of this. Many shallow people have criticized it. There's a Muslim pundit now, big guy with the beard. He's debated Jordan Peterson. He's on all the newscasts. He's a British imam. Younger guy. He basically looks like a thug. And you can see him on YouTube videos and X videos debating Christians on the street and asking them if he can slap both sides of their cheek. And, the people are bewildered, and he uses this as proof positive that the Christian doctrine can't really exist. And it's completely ridiculous. The power of forgiveness can only be employed. This is a limited or connected to the idea that you shouldn't be testing the spiritual forces. You shouldn't be running experiments. Everything to do with spiritual philosophy is for real events and real situations. So you can't walk up to someone on the street and say, "Will you let me slap both sides of your cheeks?" Because it's ridiculous. Now, if this Muslim fellow were to lose his temper and slap someone in the face, and the person didn't respond and said, "Would you like to slap the other side of my face?" he probably wouldn't do it, because it's a powerful moment of surrender. It's releasing all the energy, and when somebody engages you that way, like slaps you in the face, they're trying to engage you. They're trying to provoke you. And if they're really trying to do it and it's a real situation and you can't be provoked, then what happens is the chain of events, that energetic exchange between the two of you is broken. The cycle is broken. And the person doesn't know what to do. Now, depending on the darkness of the person you're dealing with, they may laugh at you and humiliate you some more, because that's what very dark people like to do. They like to bang their ego chest. It's like a silverback gorilla. They're not literally banging their chest, but they like to show dominance. This is how the human animal mind works, which is basically heavy ego is animal mind. It's the worst aspect of the human race and the worst aspect of us. So what forgiveness does is it opens up a window to close a cycle. Now, it doesn't always work. There are some times where it just can't work. But in times like that, it's usually because both parties are completely invested in something, and they will not redact their position one bit. And there's usually a third thing. It's not just the two egos. There's a third grounding force beside the two egos. So a classic example would be the land in Palestine, the country of Palestine. People don't like to leave a land that they have a connection to. You could say that it's a little bit superstitious because connection with land could be reestablished somewhere else. And really, at the end of the day, all you want is an ongoing existence, which is more important than anything else. So in that particular example, there is no resolution to the problem because neither party can give up the superstition of the geography. Okay? And letting go of things is also a component of forgiveness. And forgiveness is not what people think it is. It's simply not committing any energy to a cycle anymore. No more, no less than that. You want peace in your life and you're not going to go into a negative cycle. Now, the only time spiritually you're allowed to use violence or warfare is when the land you live on is attacked. So the Palestinians have spiritual right to defense. They absolutely do. The British had no business setting up that country. The Rothschilds had no business influencing British and then American politics through finance and commiseration through their dark religion to possess these countries to become tools for their ambition. I think it's the greatest evil going on the planet right now. I think the massacres in Africa that you hear about, whether it be Rwanda or whether it be the Congo or anywhere else, they don't compare. Those situations are much more animalistic and territorial. So the inability to forgive makes you darker and darker and darker and darker. The inability to let go of something, the inability to say, okay, I'll start anew. I'll go somewhere else and I'll start anew. And people are terrified to do this. They're terrified because they're attached to what they've built. And to be honest, I'm attached to what I've built up here. I've never felt more at home in my life. I don't think anywhere you could put me in the world would replace where I live now as a spiritual home for me. And fortunately for me, there's no conflict where I live. So I can't see a situation where I would be driven off my land. Forgiveness applies to every part of life. Every state of consciousness that you inhabit below self-awareness and connection to the divine creates a dual person. The dual person is the doppelganger, the sleeping person and the awake person. The awake person is in an unconscious state, and when you're bopping around and you're in your mind and you're in your senses, it's very difficult to connect with that person. And because you end up being two people, you then have to entertain the idea of self-forgiveness. The ability to forgive yourself. And that allows more of the light and love into you. Self-forgiveness is one of the most important concepts on Path. You can't really go anywhere unless you forgive yourself, because that forgiveness allows the love to keep flowing. Forgiveness is one of the most misunderstood concepts in the modern world. As it's used in the words of the Christ, the Christ is talking about opening the heart to the love of the Creator, what he calls the Father, which I think is a beautiful metaphor. Beautiful. Father. So forgiveness allows the love of the Father to come back in. But it doesn't undo the effect, the cause you've already put out into the energetic fields. And everything we put out comes back to us, eventually. And you don't start to realize this till you begin spiritual practice. If you try to explain this to somebody who is mired in sense, mind, consciousness, and self-adoration and the cultivation of ego and the adornment of self with title and status, like a Karen or a Ken, or even a successful person like a Bezos or a Mark Cuban or an Elon Musk, it's very difficult for them to understand these things. Very difficult indeed. We're really just down here blowing in the wind. And if you don't know that the wind is brought by something, then you're terrified, because you don't know where you're going. This is the true test of faith. To surrender in the moment, moment by moment. So many people, when they ask for the forgiveness of God and they feel the love of God in their heart, which is a connection to things, that's really what it is. It's a connection to things. Once you get this feeling, you hear a lot of people talk about it in immediate conversion experiences. You know, those very forceful baptisms and spiritual cleansings that the evangelicals like to do, which in very many ways is a variation on the Pentecostal stuff. Now, the Baptists do it too. Many times they think that if their sins are forgiven, there's no effect for their cause. But that's not the case. Nothing can stop something once it's in motion. Nobody who comes to this planet can stop anything once it's in motion. And always, if the effect comes back to you, it's because you put the cause out. So forgiveness is the ability to feel love again. And very few people can do it. I think we live in one of the most obstinate ages of the human race. Obstinance is the principal characteristic of people now. I will not move, I will not yield. They don't know what they're defending. You see it all the time. And you know what? The atheists have become even worse than the religious people in this now. Their virtue signaling, their false empathy. This insistence that nations be compassionate, even though a nation has no heart, it has no nervous system, it has no spirit. And many of these nations advocating this compassionate disposition. You see these debates going on everywhere in social media now. There's a popular one now that, the secular left is putting out, chastising Christians. Oh, Christ did this, 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 and this. How can you call yourself a Christian if you don't want the immigrants coming in? First of all, your spiritual responsibility never goes into a nebulous world that you do not have causal relationship with. And the digital world is a nebulous world. The world of government programs is a nebulous world. The world of institutions is a nebulous world. Compassion won't work in them because it's going through a system. And by the time it goes through a system, it goes through 24 sets of eyes and 24 sets of approvals and amendments to the original proposal. And then it comes out a success or a failure as to whether this alleged entity, the state, is going to be able to deliver the alleged compassion to the people who deserve it, or allegedly deserve it. It's complete nonsense. You should limit your compassion to what's immediately in front of you. It should be your neighbors, it should be your friends, it should be your family, if you have good relation with your family. That's where compassion grows, and that's where compassion is learned. It's not learned getting an international affairs degree or a master's degree in international affairs and then spending all your time squawking on social media about how lacking in compassion the Western world is. You should never defer your responsibility to be compassionate to an institution. There are many people out there who think they're good people because they pay their taxes, and then the government goes and does things with that money and they say, well, I did that because I paid my taxes. That's not how it works at all. That is a spiritual perversion. It has to be direct and immediate. You have to be moved by your heart. There's no thinking process. Compassion is where the heart takes over. You've all felt it. You walk down the street and, in a busy city like Toronto, which I used to habitate, and there's a stretch of Yonge Street where you can pass 100 beggars and street people in 3 or 4 blocks because there's a bunch of drop-in centers where they can get clean needles and they can get a donut and a cup of coffee and they can get in out of the cold if it's the winter. And they're all hanging out there, panhandling. And very few people give them money because you can just feel it on them. They don't deserve it. They're emitting a false need. A lot of people learn to do this as well. There was a woman in Toronto nearly 40 years ago, like when I first moved to Toronto in 1985, 86. I think in that year of 86 or 87, there was an article written about a woman who had been a fixture of the street begging scene for years. And some intrepid reporter at a daily newspaper in Toronto, I can't remember which one, decided to do a deep dive on this woman. Like, what's her backstory? How did she end up on the street? And upon engaging the woman in interview, he became suspicious based on her answers. And then he found out who she was. He found out her social insurance number, or he was able, through police resources, to determine the woman's net wealth. This woman in the mid-80s was worth over $1 million, and she had a winter home in Florida. And she had never worked, and she panhandled on the street. I think that's got to be one of the worst things you can do, is mislead the human heart. It's right up there with abusing children. And yet so many people do it. And now it's become the practice of our governments. They're in on it now too. They're all doing it. Trudeau is the worst, always tugging on the heartstrings of Canadians, like that phony beggar woman on the streets of Toronto. And then other times you're walking and somebody just looks up. Podcasting. Somebody just, let me take a second here. Okay, I'm back. Bit of a long break there. Had to talk to my son, and then I I just grabbed a little bit of meditation. So there you go. Let me reset this camera. There we go. So forgiveness is actually one of the most powerful things you can do to disentangle yourself from a very nasty situation. And in a lot of instances, it's your best option. It may not seem so at the time, but when you begin to tally up all the consequences of obstinance and doubling down on warfare, and it can be domestic warfare too. I mean, a lot of men, including myself, have gone through these very negative circumstances where it just goes on for a few years and you just keep making matters worse and worse and worse and worse. So forgiveness is absolutely critical, but it doesn't really reset anything to do with the causal force. You're still going to have to go through all of the negative effects that you created for yourself. Think of it like this. Every thought, action, and deed that you perform is a boomerang you throw out that is going to come back to you. And so when you understand this principle, you start to do the right things. And you don't start to understand this principle until you lift up your vibration a little bit. And then it becomes manifestly clear. There's no denying it. You just see it very clearly. It can't be avoided, it can't be denied, it can't be dismissed in any way, shape, or form. One of the biggest ways to get yourself into trouble is to start getting into all of the power gymnastics of the Middle Kingdom. The Reiki, the healing, the readings, the energy readings. There's so many people out there doing this now. It's unbelievable. And they're not qualified. Nobody's qualified to do these things, except maybe a fully realized being. And they know better than to do it. And so many people get into trouble using these abilities and violating the laws down here. You see, the hologram we live in can only be breached and broken by your effort alone. It can't be done by anybody else because it can't be proven to anybody else. It has to be proven to each and every person in their own time. That, by the way, is why they call it a realization. That's why, right there. It's you realize something. Realizing something and understanding something are two different things. Understanding something means that you have a mental understanding of it. Realizing it means that it's a living principle within your life now. And those two things are very, very different. Very, very different indeed, actually. So we're in a big cleanup cycle right now. And a lot of the stuff that's been going on for decades now is coming out. And it's going to be horrifying. I mean, just the stuff that they're uncovering now at DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, is absolutely astounding. They have 1,000,001 agencies and forces and departments to police the individual American taxpayer. But they themselves operate with zero oversight. And over time, this hubris has created a monster, and it's their monster. They let it loose, and they let it go and eat things and rob and loot and pillage. They profited from it, and now it's come home. It's come home for shelter, and there is no shelter. There's nowhere to get away from this now. And then you throw into that all of the mind programming and all of the mind control that so many people are under. And you're going to start to understand that the threat of the far right was never there. That was just another bunch of bullshit that they created to distract and deflect away from themselves. I haven't seen any big bombshells yet as a result of the disclosure being released on JFK. That's going to be quite shocking. And if it's the real disclosure, I suspect that it will lead back to the Mossad. Among other parties, but the Mossad. You see, the real deep state has always been Israel. It's been Israel from the beginning. It's been the rabbis from the beginning. Because the intelligence that America has been working off of is based on this ritual magic that crept in with the Dutch reformers who came over and all the initiates into Jewish ritual magic in the Gentile world through Freemasonry and the Martinists, and I suppose you could say some aspects of Rosicrucianism, but I think Rosicrucianism might be the cleanest one of them all because I've met a lot of good Rosicrucians. The key to all the worlds is an open heart. But opening your heart in a world this vile is one of the scariest things you can do. And you can't really do it without the consent and cooperation of the divine. Because that's what gives you the understanding to cope with everything that you're going to see with an open heart. Every failure in this world is a failure to love. Everything goes back to love. Now, tomorrow, and the next day. The only real conspiracies that have been going on down here are the conspiracies to delude and defraud and defame people who are close to the truth and trying to tell other people. This will be a very difficult knot to untie. And a lot of people don't want it untied. A lot of people are very accustomed to living within, let's just say, their own private Idaho, their own private reality. It's not going to work. Now, as we go into this, you're going to have to be able to forgive. You see, the negatives in the consciousness game are masters of entanglement. They want you to jump into the mud and fight them and get your new Sunday clothes dirty. And then when the sheriff comes and he sees two muddy people in the pig pen, he just sees two idiots. And you're both in trouble. The power of forgiveness is the power to let go. The power of forgiveness is the power to love your enemies. That holds true for the metaphysical as well. It was a tremendous leap forward for me to be able to love the demons and love the negative principalities by realizing that they have a job to do and the world would be completely imbalanced if they didn't exist. And the world in large measure has been completely imbalanced because their mission and their function has been co-opted. As human beings begin stepping into their power in the coming decades, one of the things that will become most apparent is that power is almost useless. And that the real inversion is that surrender and humility are the greatest power. But it's a power that's never picked up. It's a sword that's never unsheathed. There's all these ironies and judo flips and inversions as you go into the multidimensional reality. And the only consistent through all of these dimensions is the consistency of love. And love is harmony, and it's allowing the energy that comes into you to go out. It's all of these things. Forgiveness will set you free. I don't know who needs to hear this. Me, for one. It is something that I need to be constantly reminded of. The power of forgiveness. You know, my son and I had an interesting conversation the other day. We've been doing a lot of devotional work. And we've been living very clean this trip. Usually when he comes over, it's a party. Because young people, he usually invites one or two of his friends over when he comes to visit. They're not here for his whole visit. He might be here for 2 or 3 months, but he'll have a friend come over for 3 weeks. And they just go hog wild, smoking the weed and doing what young men do, I suppose, in this generation. But this trip has been the exact opposite. It's been one of discipline and forbearance in the inner journey. And what happens is you remember. So when you're working in higher states of consciousness, when you go to a lower state of consciousness, you don't remember the things that happened at the higher state of consciousness. When you get back to discipline and forbearance in your spiritual practice, you start to have a life memory that is illuminated by all the spiritual high points. So when you hit a high point of consciousness in your devotional practice, your spiritual memory will identify all the times in this lifetime that you've been on or near that state of consciousness. And what happens then is you ask yourself, how did I ever forget this? But these subtleties and these energies, they're like dreams, How hard it can be to remember dreams. They come and they go. Anyways, the human being is going into a great remembrance. And when it starts to happen, it can't be stopped. And they've been trying to hammer this down like whack-a-mole for centuries, but they can't do it anymore. And it's beautiful. It's going to be beautiful. To all of you interested in sharing this, I strongly suggest that you clean up. Cleaning up is the most important thing you can do. Cleaning up your thinking, cleaning up your life, cleaning up every dimension of your existence. Trying to be a worthy vessel of the divine. I don't mean to be so preachy today. I don't know where this came from. I just roll with it. That's enough for today, a slightly shorter one. I'm Bruce McDonald, and this has been the Talamanca Review. And I love you guys. Even though I've never met you, I love you.